Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams of water in the desert wasteland. In ancient Israel, the people of God were waiting for a day when this crazy, messed up world would be made right. The chaotic wilderness of the desert that surrounded their country was the perfect image to describe the chaos of the world. Famine, disease, and destruction, poverty, hunger, and injustice. The darkness was deep, the problem seemed too big. The chaotic wilderness was taking over. But still they hungered and thirsted for righteousness, for justice, for the world to be made right. They were dying of thirst. They needed those streams of water in the desert, someone to come, someone to satisfy that thirst. They needed someone to make a way. The good news is, Jesus was that someone. Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Jesus is that way in the wilderness. Jesus is the one who brings streams of water in the desert, streams of living water that bring life. Just like the people of Israel, we also long for the world to be made right. The way of Jesus is the path to that goal. We are followers of the way. We are wayfarers.
From the dust you created us, and from the heavens you formed, in breathing out beauty you crafted existence, and now the earth responds in reverence. But you are God and God alone.
Now the earth cries. Alrighty, what's up, everybody? So my name is Nick Griffin. I am the lead pastor here at Wayfarers Christian Church, and I am super excited that you are joining us here today. I'm super excited that we got here. If I'm being completely honest, I wasn't sure if we were going to get here today. I wasn't sure if this was all going to happen. If you were tuned in with us a little bit earlier, we usually try to live stream these services, but we had a ton of technical difficulties today. It was one of those days where just everything was going wrong. One thing after another thing kept breaking, and eventually we were like, what, we're gonna call it. We're gonna pre-record it. We're gonna release it a little bit later, and that's kind of cool too. I think that'll be nice. It's a little bit more relaxing for me, if I'm being completely honest, not having to be live in the moment. I'm able to sit back, relax a little bit. Hopefully you can too. Just sit back, relax. You'll be able to watch this recording of this service whenever you want, at your own leisure, on your own time. If you want to watch it in a few sections, if you want to watch it all at once, it's up to you. You do you. We're giving you that opportunity this week. And so either way, like I said, I'm just excited. We got something done. We're out. We figured it out. We made something happen this week. Now, if you have been tuning in with us the last couple weeks, you probably recognized that last song that you just heard. That's actually a recording from one of our previous live services just last week, in fact. That is our Wayfarers band here, our band. They were performing an original song, a song that they wrote. Particularly, it's a song that our worship leaders, Joey and Reagan, wrote. I don't know that was super clear to some of y'all whenever everybody was watching the stream last week. And so we wanted to give you a chance to hear that song again, to hear a song that's an original song written by members of the church here. It's a song that we're hoping you're going to be able to kind of get in your head, something that you're going to be singing yourself, something that you'll be able to claim and say, yeah, this is unique. This is unique to Wayfarers. This is something that we are doing exclusively here at our church. And I think it's an incredible song. I don't know about you, but I think it's super catchy. It gets stuck in my head. And I love the message. I love the message of just the power of what God is wanting to do. There's no hindrance to God's power. He is all powerful. So I wanted to give you guys a chance to hear another original song, one from the very first live stream that we did here at Wayfarers. It's another song that was written by Joey and Reagan that has a really awesome message. And again, I just want to give as many opportunities for y'all to hear this music, hear these songs, start to learn them. And maybe whenever we finally get the opportunity to worship all together, we will already know these songs and we'll be able to sing them kind of all together as a church. And I'm really excited. I'm really looking forward to that. So check out this song from our very first live stream.
Of your the way it's meant to be. But it's not about us, it's about what you've done. So Lord, teach us how to be one and open our minds to see how you see as we take the cross, the way it's meant to be. But it's not about us, it's about what you've done. So Lord, teach us how to be one and open our minds to see how you see as we take the cross, the way it's meant to be. But it's not about us, it's about what you've done. So Lord, teach us how to be one, how to be one. Everlasting to everlasting you are. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever the earth and whole world, from everlasting to everlasting you are.
Ok, voy a leer Mateo capítulo 11, versículo del 2 al 6. Juan el Bautista, que estaba en la cárcel, oyó hablar de todo lo que Jesús hacía y envió a algunos de sus propios discípulos para que le preguntaran a Jesús: ¿Eres tú el Mesías que Dios prometió enviarnos o debemos esperar a otro? Jesús respondió: regresen y cuéntenle a Juan todo lo que ustedes están oyendo y viendo. Ahora, los ciegos pueden ver, los cojos caminan bien, los leprosos quedan sanos y los sordos ya pueden oír. Los que estaban muertos han vuelto a la vida y a los pobres se les anuncia la buena noticia de salvación. Dios va a bendecir a los que me ven hacer esto y no me abandonan.
Matthew chapter 11, verse 2. When John heard in prison what the Messiah was doing, he sent his disciples to ask him, "Are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else?" And Jesus replied, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me."
All right, so shout out to my parents there. That was Larry and Ruth Griffin reading the verse that we're going to be talking about today. I mentioned last week that this is something I want to do a lot. I want to give all of y'all the opportunities to read the different passages that we're going to be talking about during each of the sermons. So if you're interested at all in that, definitely just message us, wherever you're watching, if it's on Facebook, if it's on YouTube, if it's on Instagram, just send us over a message, say, hey, I want to be a part of the scripture reading, and I will send you guys over something to read, and we'll be able to throw it in our services. I think it'll be a cool way to get a lot of us involved in what's going on here so that you don't have to just hear me, a whole lot of me, all of the time. Today we're going to be continuing our series on the gospel, on the good news. I've been talking for the last few weeks about what the good news really is, how Jesus talked about the good news. There's a particular Greek word I mentioned that he uses. It's this word euangelion, which literally means the good news. It often gets translated the gospel. when people are talking about the gospel, that's the word that they are using. And the verse that my parents just read here a second ago is actually one of the few verses where we see Jesus actually use that Greek word. He actually uses that word, meaning the good news. And it's right there at the very end of the verse where he talks about the good news being preached to the poor. Just to give you a little bit of context of what's going on in this verse at this time, this is kind of towards the end of John the Baptist's life. John the Baptist is another major character that you see a lot of in the Bible. And John the Baptist was supposed to kind of pave the way for the Messiah, for the King of Israel that was going to come. And he's one of the first ones that announces Jesus as the King. But this is towards the end of his life. He's about to be executed for some of his own work that he's been doing. And right before dying, you can tell he's having some doubts. He's having some questions. He's not quite sure. Is Jesus really the Messiah? Is he really the King that is to come? So John the Baptist sends some of his disciples to go to Jesus and to ask him. He just wants them to ask him flat out, are you the Messiah, or should we be waiting for somebody else? And I love Jesus' response. Jesus specifically tells him, go and look. Go and pay attention. Go and look at all of the miracles. Look at all of the healings. Look at all of the things that I'm doing. But I love that last verse where he specifically says that the good news is being preached to the poor. In Jesus' mind, the good news being preached to the poor, good news for the poor, is essential to his job as Messiah. It is essential to his job as King. It is essential to his job as Savior. Now, that's not really a controversial point. I'm sure a lot of us really, agree with that idea that the good news being preached to the poor, that's something that we can really all get behind. It's something that Christianity has been about from the very beginning. But I want us to really focus in on the fact of how often when Jesus talks about the good news, when Jesus talks about what he is there to do, how often he mentions the poor. It comes up a lot. It was essential to Jesus' ministry, like I said. And like I said, that's not really that controversial, or at least it shouldn't be. We don't think it should be that controversial that we would be helping the poor. Helping the poor is an essential part of Christianity. But recently, for some reason or another, especially in our culture, especially here in the States, this has become really controversial. This really came to head with me recently. There is a pastor in New York City named Tim Keller. He is a pretty famous pastor. Some of you may have heard of him. He's written a lot of books and talked a lot about defending Christianity and the logic of Christianity. He's a great apologist, is the word that a lot of people use. And I've really enjoyed his ministry, really enjoyed a lot of what I've gotten out of him. He is somebody who really values the Bible. He's a really smart guy, one of those really smart guys that's probably forgotten more about the Bible than I will ever know. And I just love everything that he has to say. Over the last few weeks, he's been posting a lot about this exact topic, about the idea that helping the poor is a major part of Christianity. And it's kind of crazy. He's been getting a ton of pushback for it. If you go on his Twitter, whenever he starts tweeting about it, he will get these responses. The comments under it are just extra toxic. Now, I know the internet is just generally toxic all around, but if you look at some of the comments under Tim Keller's tweets about the poor, the comments are just extra toxic. They are extra mean-spirited. It is a very divisive issue for some reason. Like I said, I don't know why helping the poor would suddenly become such a divisive issue. But in a few of the comments, you kind of start to get an idea of exactly why the issue has become so difficult and so divisive. And it really has to do with some of the politics that have gotten involved in that particular issue. And Tim Keller addressed this head-on directly in a tweet. In that tweet, Tim Keller says, talking about oppression, injustice, etc., it doesn't make one a Marxist. It makes one a student of the Bible. Now, there's a specific word I want us to focus on there in his tweet, a Marxist. This term has a lot to do with the teachings of Karl Marx, kind of the famous founder of a lot of the political ideologies that get defined as socialism or communism. Somewhere along the line, helping the poor became directly connected with these ideas of socialism and communism. Now, that was a big part of what socialism and communism was started to address. That is specifically a big major factor that Karl Marx was focusing on. He was focusing on helping the poor. So obviously, helping the poor is definitely a major part of those political ideologies. But it's really funny, because of the way politics have turned out in our culture, because of the way our country is, somewhere along the line, communists, Marxists, socialists, they got like a monopoly on helping the poor. Helping the poor became only about being a communist or a socialist for a lot of people. And these are the accusations that kept being levied at Tim Keller. Under his tweets, you would just see all of these people calling him out, calling him a Marxist specifically for his claims about the importance of helping the poor. And his point is a point that I think I would affirm. Talking about those things is very biblical. It's not Marxist. It's actually being a good student of the Bible. It's funny, it got me thinking a lot about some of my own experiences, specifically as a Hispanic person. Now, obviously, many of you know there are dozens of Hispanic countries in the world, countries that speak Spanish. I know often, lots of times, people like to confuse it and think, oh, they're just all Mexicans. But Mexico is just one of the many countries, one of the many Hispanic countries that there are in the world. And it's really funny, if you grew up Hispanic, I particularly grew up, I was born in the country of Uruguay. And if you talk to Uruguayans, if you talk to Chileans, if you talk to Colombians, if you talk to people from all kinds of different Hispanic countries, there's this one issue that is another one that becomes weirdly divisive, which is the question, where does the avocado come from? Who gets to claim the avocado? Now, I was a student at a really cool college here in town, which is the campus we're actually streaming from right now, called Mid-South Christian College. And Mid-South was this bilingual school that had students from the States and students from Latin America all studying together. And I distinctly remember this one time we were all hanging out, we were all in the cafeteria, and this topic came up of, where does the avocado come from? One of the American students was just talking about how into avocados they've been recently. It's a very millennial thing to be really into avocados. They were talking about how much they love avocados. And they asked one of the students, avocados are from Mexico, right? And one of the Mexican students said, yeah, avocados are from Mexico. And immediately the students from other countries, they all jumped in. Everybody had to claim where that their country was where avocados originated. It's weird. It was one of the most heated arguments I've ever seen at the school. It wasn't about theology. It wasn't about the Bible. It wasn't even about politics. One of the most heated arguments I ever heard at this school was Hispanic students trying to argue over who gets to claim the avocado. And I think a big part of it is because a particular marketing campaign, again, the American student said, avocados are from Mexico, right? There's a little jingle, there's a commercial that has been playing in the United States that says that specifically, avocados from Mexico. It's got this little song. You may have seen it. You may have heard that little jingle. And because of how effective that marketing has been, for Americans at least, that's the truth. Avocados are from Mexico. And it's weird because I think this is kind of what's happened with socialism, with communism, and with the poor. Because it is so essential to those political worldviews, they talk about it a lot. They have attached their brand specifically to helping the poor. So when people think about the poor, when people think about helping the poor, they immediately start thinking about these other political ideologies. Now, this is one of those issues that I weirdly get riled up about, kind of in a similar way as how some of those Hispanic students did here at the school. Because I really believe that the Christians were the ones who really were the original people who could claim that as a part of their brand. The Christians were the first ones who really focused on helping the poor in a way that was world-changing. There's a really incredible book that I would recommend to all of you. It's a book called Destroyer of the Gods by an author named Larry Hurtado. And in this book, Larry Hurtado focuses specifically on those first Christians for the first few hundred years of the church. And in the book, he includes all these letters and all of these just little quotes that were written from other people, other Romans, other Jews, other Greeks, other pagans that weren't Christians. And it just kind of gives you a perspective of how those people viewed the Christians specifically. And the one issue that kept coming up over and over and over and over again was the fact that they were there to help the poor. The good news of the gospel was specifically about helping the poor, especially for those early Christians. They were the original ones who could claim that as a part of their brand. And it's unfortunate to me that somewhere along the line that seems to have gotten separated from Christianity. Caring for the poor is one of the most Christian things I can possibly think of. And somewhere along the line that got separated. Lots of times when people are trying to defend that connection, the importance of caring for the poor, they'll jump to a lot of Old Testament passages, and there are hundreds of them. There's these tons of passages in the Old Testament where I could go through over and over and over again, specifically pointing out all of the times when it's very important to God that his people would care for the poor. But unfortunately, when you start bringing that up, it's really easy for people sometimes to just dismiss it and say, oh, that's the Old Testament. That was for the Jewish people. We're Christians. We're New Testament people. This is a whole another thing for us. So today I wanted to just specifically make a case again for how central to Christianity caring for the poor is. And I'm going to do it just by focusing on a few New Testament passages. And I've just got 3 in particular that I want to show you. And I'm hoping by the end of looking through these verses, you will be able to see exactly what I'm saying. You really can't have Christianity, you can't have the good news without preaching to the poor, without it actually being good news for the poor. So the very first passage I want to jump to is in Galatians. So it's Galatians 2, starting in verse 9. James, Cephas, and John, those esteemed as pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised. All they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I had been eager to do all along. This verse specifically is Paul speaking. Paul is talking about a particular trip that he took to Jerusalem to meet with some of the pillars, he calls them, the original apostles. And he specifically mentions James and Peter. And this is an interesting time in the church where they're trying to figure out whether they are supposed to only go to the Jews or whether they are supposed to go to the Gentiles. So they have this meeting where they talk about it, and they agree that it's going to be Paul's mission specifically for him to go to the Gentiles. And that's exactly what Paul wants to do. But there's that really interesting verse at the end where James and Peter, they tell Paul, before you go to the Gentiles, before you go on that mission, we don't want you to forget, please do not forget the poor. And it's really interesting to me as well that Paul specifically says, of course I'm not going to forget the poor. That's something that I was super eager to do. It's really funny to me how much both of the apostles in Jerusalem and Paul himself, this apostle to the Gentiles, for both of them, helping the poor was central to the gospel. There was no way that was going to be something that they were just going to leave behind. Even Paul, a missionary specifically, somebody who's specifically wanting to go out and reach the Gentile world, reach outside of the Jewish world, one of the most central things for him, despite that mission, is helping the poor. That's something that he was not going to forget. That's something that he did not want to ignore. There's a second verse I wanted to jump to a little bit here as well in the book of Acts. So this is Acts chapter 10, starting in verse 1. At Caesarea there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion in what was known as the Italian regiment. He and all his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. One day, at about 3 p.m, he had a vision. He distinctly saw an angel of God who came to him and said, "Cornelius." Cornelius stared at him in fear. "What is it, Lord?" he asked. The angel answered, "Your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God. Now send men to Joppa to bring back a man named Simon, who is called Peter." What we're seeing in this story is the very first Gentile, the very first person who is not a Jew that gets the good news of Jesus, the good news of the gospel preached to him. And he has this amazing vision of an angel. This angel tells him to go and to send for Peter specifically so that Peter can come and preach the gospel, preach the good news to him. And I remember when I was in college and reading this passage, those specific words at the end of verse 4 really stuck out to me, where it mentions that God has noticed Cornelius' gifts to the poor. That is something that has specifically commended him to God. The very first Gentile who has the gospel preached to him is commended, is praised by God for helping the poor. It mentions that his prayers were heard by God and his gifts to the poor were recognized by God. It was not just his spiritual connection, his seeking after God, that God noticed. God also specifically noticed the way that he helped the poor. And I don't think that's an accident. I don't think that is something that is just thrown in there as a nice little extra point in this verse. I think specifically it is very, very important to God. He wants people who care about the poor and who help the poor. So when he was looking for somebody to be this kind of amazing example of one of the very first Gentiles that would have the gospel preached to him, he specifically found a man who also had the same heart as him, a man who actually cared about helping the poor. There's one more verse I want to read for you to just really drive home this point. And this is one of the most strongly worded verses of all of them, in fact. And this is from 1 John. And it is 1 John chapter 3, starting in verse 17 specifically. And again, listen to the strong words that John uses when he is talking to the church. He says to them, "If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth." Specifically here, John is calling out those people who would claim to have the love of God, but who don't have pity on their brothers and sisters, those that are in need, those people who don't have pity on the poor. And again, like I said, these very strong words where he specifically says, if you don't have pity for the poor, how can you say that the love of God is in you? That's something that's really hard for us to hear sometimes. I personally think that I know a lot of people who would claim to have the love of God in them, but when I look at their lives, I don't see any examples of that pity of those in need. I don't see any ways in which they themselves are sacrificing and taking those actions that John specifically says they need to take to help the poor. I could go on and on. There really are so many verses all over the New Testament and the Old Testament specifically. It is this thread that runs all the way through the Bible about God's heart for the poor and for those that are in need. I hope that I've made the point to you. Like I said, I don't want to just keep reading more and more verses, but if we needed to, I could just keep going and keep going and keep going, and that mountain of evidence would build up to show you how much I think that the brand of Christianity and helping the poor are two things that really go together. You can't separate those out. You cannot have Christianity without helping the poor. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this sermon, that really isn't something that is super controversial. I would venture to say that many of you that are watching, if you would call yourselves Christians, you would say that you affirm that. You definitely affirm that Christianity and helping the poor go hand in hand. The issue we end up having is, how do we do that? How do we do that as Christians? How should we help the poor? There's all kinds of different ways, all kinds of different solutions that people come up with about how to help the poor. They might think that we just as individuals need to be charitably giving large sums of money directly to the poor, to those that need it. They may think, well, no, maybe our job is to give to charities, to give to nonprofits, to give to 501c3s, and let them help the poor. There's other people who would say it's our job to give to the government, to pay our taxes, and to let the government help the poor. There's all kinds of options and opportunities for how to help the poor, and really that's where a lot of the arguments happen. And that's where people really disagree. If you're more conservative, you would say, no, we don't need to rely on the government to help the poor. If you're more liberal, you would say, we can't trust individuals, we can't trust these wealthy people to actually help the poor. And I think that's arguments that we need to have. I'm one of these people that does not believe that we need to keep politics outside of the church. I think that is detrimental to us. We need to be talking about this. If we believe as Christians that we need to help the poor, then I think we need to be talking it out. I think we need to be arguing. I think we need to be doing it all in love. But we need to be trying to decide what is the best way to do that. Now, of those options that I mentioned, probably the most controversial for a lot of Christians is having the government be the one that helps the poor. A lot of people may say, well, there's no real biblical basis for that. Individuals can help, but not the government. I used to think that myself, but honestly, I've been changing my perspective on it a little bit. Every week I've been mentioning that Noah, our teaching pastor, and myself, we do these deep dives on Wednesdays at 5 o'clock where we go into some of the issues that I wasn't able to get into in detail in the sermon. And specifically, that's the issue we're going to be dealing with this week. Is it possible that it is a Christian ideal for the government to help the poor? I won't tell you any more than that. I'm just going to tease it. You have to check it out if you want to hear what we have to say. But I think you might be surprised by some of the answers. But rather than focusing on any of those, I wanted to end today by just focusing on one specifically. This is just one specific application that I hope we can take out of how we as Christians can help the poor. And this application comes out of the book of James. Now the verse is James 5, starting in verse 1 through 6. Now listen, you rich people. Weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you, and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. Just like that 1 John passage, this is another very strongly worded passage. The very first time I read this verse, I was in college, and we were reading through a whole bunch of different verses that had to do with this particular issue that we're talking about today. And I remember the condemnation that comes from James against people specifically who don't pay wages to those who work for them. You can just kind of feel the emotions and the anger that he has for those kinds of people. Here specifically, we see James saying, if you are not paying your workers the wages they deserve for their work, you are in sin. You are going to be condemned for that. You need to expect condemnation from God for that. This is something that really came to head for me whenever I had my first experience as a business owner. I, along with some of my friends, we helped to start this coffee shop called Avenue Coffee. Unfortunately, it just recently closed. R.I.P. Avenue Coffee. Pour out a cold brew for your friends at Avenue Coffee. It was an amazing experience while it lasted, and it lasted for several years. But I remember right at the beginning of Avenue Coffee, I was kind of stepping into what it would look like for me to be a boss, and specifically to be a boss who was going to decide what I was going to pay my workers. I had these awesome ideas about how we were going to take our tips and we were going to donate those tips to charities and other nonprofits in the area. And as I started to read through the Bible and started to really look at the lives of my workers, I realized that if I was going to do my job as a Christian business owner specifically, I needed to make sure that I was paying my workers a good wage. That was something important. That was an essential part of my faith. That was maybe one of the ways that I could help those in need, by paying a good wage. That's something that I've tried to do in everything I've done since that point. Even here at Wayfarers specifically, the people who work for me here at the church, I have made every effort possible to pay them a good living wage. It's really hard. It's especially hard in churches. I don't know if any of you are familiar with how churches work, but church workers are just criminally underpaid. They get paid next to nothing for the difficult work that they do in the church. And this is inconceivable to me. I think if James saw the way churches pay leaders in the church, he would say that is something that is just counter to Christianity, counter to the gospel, counter to the good news. Part of the way that we can help the needy, part of the way that we can help the poor, is that we can make sure that we are paying living wages, good wages to those that are working for us. And can you imagine the testimony that would come from that? The testimony that would come if Christians were known as being the people who paid well. Can you imagine how much of a testimony to the good news, how much the good news would really seem like good news to the world if the one thing they knew about Christians was that Christians paid well? If you were going to work for a Christian, you were going to get paid, you were going to get paid on time, and it was going to be a good salary. If you take a moment to just imagine that world with me, I think you could easily see how much of an impact that could really have. And unfortunately, that isn't the way that Christians are perceived. I want to be a little bit of a part of making that change. I want to be a little bit of a part of changing how people think about Christians specifically. And my hope is that Christians will once again be known as the people who help the poor. When the poor are mentioned, I don't want the first thought to be socialist, communist, Marxist. When people think about the poor and helping the poor, I want the very first thought to be Christians, the followers of Jesus, and the followers of the way. Now, to finish up here, I asked my friend Jacob to read a really cool prayer that I found on Instagram recently. I found this really amazing Instagram page that's just called Black Liturgies. And this woman Cole, she has been writing these incredible prayers, these incredible liturgies, she calls them, just about all of the current events and issues that are going on in the church. And I love her perspective specifically as a Black woman. Some of these prayers are really beautiful, and I love the perspective that we are able to see in the way that she prays to God. And she posts her prayers on this Instagram page so that hopefully we would be able to go and we'd be able to read them, and they would give us words that we could use when we pray to God specifically. That's one of the amazing things about liturgy. Sometimes when we don't have words, you may not be very wordy, you may not be very eloquent, you're not sure how to pray, you're not sure what words to use to pray. I love that we as the church, we can take advantage of some of our other brothers and sisters who are more eloquent. They can write out prayers, and that they can give us the words that we may not have. And this week, I specifically saw that in one of the prayers that Cole posted. She posted specifically about courage, asking God for courage to do what is right. Because this issue has become so politicized in America, it's kind of scary to talk about it. If I'm going to be honest, I was even scared to preach this sermon specifically. It really isn't something that should be controversial, but I knew that by just talking about some of these topics and even bringing up some of these ideas and even bringing up politics specifically, there was going to be a chance that there were going to be a few people that were going to be very angry with me for talking about any of this in the church. In some ways, I was afraid that I was going to receive some of the same criticism that I've seen Tim Keller receive when he tweets about helping the poor. And there were several times where I thought about just changing the topic, about preaching about something different. But I myself am very convicted about this. I don't know that you can preach the gospel without preaching the good news to the poor. It was essential to Jesus. It was essential to the early church. And it should be essential to me as well. So I had to just muster up some courage, put the sermon together, and preach it, even if I might get some negative response, some negative feedback from people. So for those of you out there who are looking for things to pray for, I would pray that I would ask you that you would pray for me. Pray for me to have courage to say the things that I know need to be said. And that's something that I think all of us need to pray for. And so I love this specific prayer that Cole posted, where she asks God for courage. I had my friend Jacob read it, and I would encourage you, as you watch this video, pray along with him. Pray along in the specific prayer where we ask God for courage to do what is right, and in this specific instance, where we ask God for courage to help the poor. Let's watch the video.
Will you pray with me? God, make our minds up to do justice. Give us that courage which does not depend on naive fearlessness, but rather allow us to do what must be done despite our fear. We want to be people who know when to risk ourselves and when to wait. Restore to us a portrait of justice that is the long journey of doing what must be done. Plant our souls so firmly in the truth of the dignity of our neighbor that the powers of fear and intimidation cannot uproot us, but rather fall on us like a breeze, reminding us we are those who can only be moved by our Maker. Amen.